Hey everybody, welcome to Narrative Live on a Friday evening. Sorry we were a few minutes late, but we're very excited to be with you tonight because we're continuing our conversation with Steve Hoffenberg, Jeffrey Epstein's former business partner, who's here to keep telling us about Iran-Contra and also about Towers Financial. And the Iran-Contra angle is the one we're introducing tonight. Also with us, Lincoln's Bible and Eric Garland. How are you guys?
Good, good. How is everybody out there?
Eric,
Doing
BLB,
great.
we had a good response
Hi,
last week.
everyone.
And I wanted to sort of get us going into this week because we're going to be talking a lot about Iran-Contra and how the money got into Towers Financial, or maybe got into Towers Financial, by going back to November 25th, 1986. This is the day that sort of changed the world for Ronald Reagan. It's on that day where he could no longer really admit or say or pretend that the Iran-Contra scandal was not beginning to tear away at his presidency, and also the day when he began to lose the confidence of the conservatives within the Republican Party.
Although not directly involved, Vice Admiral John Poindexter has asked to be relieved of his assignment as Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and to return to another assignment in the Navy. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North has been relieved of his duties on the National Security Council staff. I am deeply troubled that the implementation of a policy aimed at resolving a truly tragic situation in the Middle East has resulted in such controversy. As I've stated previously, I believe our policy goals toward Iran were well-founded. However, the information brought to my attention yesterday convinced me that in one aspect, implementation of that policy was seriously flawed. While I cannot reverse what has happened, I'm initiating steps, including those I've announced today, to assure that the implementation of all future foreign and national security policy initiatives will proceed only in accordance with my authorization. Over the past 6 years, we've realized many foreign policy goals. I believe we can yet achieve, and I intend to pursue, the objectives on which we all agree: a safer, more secure, and stable world. And now I'm going to ask Attorney General Meese to brief you.
Do you still maintain you didn't make a mistake, Mr. President?
Hold it.
Did you make a mistake in sending arms to Tehran, sir?
No, and I'm not taking any more questions. In just a second, I'm going to ask Attorney General Meese to brief you on what we presently know of what he has found
Is
out.
anyone else going to be let go, sir? Is anyone else going to be let go?
No one was let go. They chose to go.
Now, of course, that is not what happened. They were let go, and there was a lot more than letting go that happened. At the end of the day, it was Bill Barr that sort of saved the day for the White House by pardoning a lot of the people involved. Now, Steve, most people don't think about Jeffrey Epstein and Iran-Contra in the same breath. But we're suggesting tonight that there is some sort of connection there. What do you think the connection is?
Well, I know what the connection is. I don't think about it because I know what Jeffrey Epstein did with the Leese family and with the Khashoggi people and in this Iran-Contra. Jeffrey Epstein had a role to play in his job. He was employed by a company that his CEO, Douglas Leese, and his co-worker, Julian Leese, and his brother, Nicholas Leese, they were all entrenched in what you just heard about President Reagan. And Jeffrey Epstein had an important job in the arms sales. So Jeffrey Epstein made a lot of money from the arms sales in his job overseas after he left Stearns.
And he was working for whom at the time? For Douglas Leese, who was working for?
Douglas Leese was the CEO of a large group of companies, of arms dealers, of financial enterprises that moved money around the world. And he was very prominent in the UK and the Middle East. He had a tremendous deep relationship with Adnan Khashoggi, and Jeffrey Epstein was Douglas Leese's assistant in investment banking with Julian Leese, who's going to come forward now and is going to enlighten everybody soon.
Can you just say what you just say again? You think Julian Leese is going to come forward to cooperate?
I think Julian Leese has a role to play that's the most substantial role in the Jeffrey Epstein mystery, because Julian Leese worked side by side with Jeffrey Epstein in the 80s and 90s. And it's time for Julian Leese to step forward and explain.
Was this at
He's
Towers
living in
Financial
the
that he was
UK.
working? He was working.
He was working on 2 or 3 pages of responsibilities. One was his family lease company's business. The other was Towers Financial, and the others were the clients that were serviced by all of those companies.
In your
And
offices?
Jeffrey Epstein worked with him.
In your offices or at the lease offices?
Around the world.
Around the world.
They didn't work behind the desk. They traveled around the world to do their jobs.
So let's go back a little bit here. That's big news, by the way, guys. You know, Julian Leese is, of the principals who would know what Jeffrey Epstein did all those years. Julian Leese is one of those people who would know what happens, particularly with financial crimes and the arms trading, which is an area that most people have not really discussed. So I'm interested in hearing both LB and Eric's reaction to that.
Oh, I like it. I want to hear what this guy has to say. How did he meet Jeffrey? Was it through Robert Maxwell? I think we know all of that. When was? I'm sorry, there's an echo, a little bit of an echo.
Okay.
When was the meeting? Why was it an intimate relationship? How was Jeffrey trained? What did they train him to do? I like all that.
Eric?
I'm listening.
Now, Steve, you worked there, right? You worked for the Leases as well. We mentioned this last week, and I don't want to move beyond Lease right now without explaining why your role there was so different from Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, I was invited by the Leases and the others in their circle to do the similar work that Jeffrey Epstein was doing in the sales and intelligence gathering, and I rejected that invitation to participate in that business. And Jeffrey Epstein undertook that responsibility. And others asked me this week, a matter of fact, as to why I rejected it, because I was offered a lot of money and a lot of opportunity, but I said the crimes were so great in America, different from the different countries around the world where they were operating, that I would not consider participating with them in that business.
So you were aware this was going to be criminal?
Go ahead.
Yeah. You were aware this was going to be a criminal endeavor or could be viewed as criminal?
There was no question that once you brought it into America, North America, the United States of America, that would be illegal. There was no doubt about it. And it showed itself terribly so with what's taking place now, unfortunately, in the Jeffrey Epstein mystery. That's why it's a mystery. That's why we're not seeing the transparency that we would all like to see.
Is this because...
Can I ask a question?
Sure, of course. Go ahead.
Okay. Steve, how did you meet the Leases?
I met them through political contacts in Washington and Virginia and New York. It was
Why
an
did you have
introduction
political
to them.
contacts in Washington? What was happening there? Was it campaign donations?
Yes, Leese was very political, and Leese wanted to be more political in the Washington circle, in the inner circle, inside the Beltway. And I spent a lot of time with Leese inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., and I introduced him to a lot of members of Congress and got him very comfortable, and the members of Congress very comfortable with Leese. And then he and Epstein, they did what they did with Khashoggi. It was a very unusual time. And Zev has done a lot of connecting of dots here and is telling the untold story that Epstein made an awful lot of money in this business dealing with these other countries and armament and money moving back and forth.
Let me ask you if it's clear to say that Leese worked for the Queen, or did he work for the royal family, or was he just broadly working for the MI6? Sorry.
You know, the inner workings of the crown, the royal family, and the inner workings of an asset for the intelligence group in the United Kingdom, that's a special inside club.
Right.
That nobody's going to be able to go on air and tell you the step-by-step involvement that Douglas Leese had with the crown, even though he was knighted twice by the Queen. Yep. But nobody's going to go on the air and tell you step-by-step of what he did. But he's been published, and it's very focused that he was an asset of the intelligence gathering in the UK. And a very good asset, very successful.
We're going to go through a lot more of his history in a bit, but I want to back up to 1981, which is when Donald Trump first encountered, or one of the first times he encountered, Adnan Khashoggi, when Donald Trump was staying at the Olympic Tower, with a famed building that was, part condominium, part office building in Midtown Manhattan, very close to where your office was at Towers Financial. And he was living there for 3 years, between 1981 and 1983. And it was this high roller kind of environment. Adnan Khashoggi would throw these big parties, other big foreign dignitaries would throw big parties, and Donald Trump attended one of those parties, and he immediately, on leaving that party, decided to redo his plans for the Trump Tower because he felt so inspired by what he'd seen. Can you describe what that time was like in the early 1980s as all this foreign money was showing up in America, and some of it from criminal, or at least not always legal sources like Adnan Khashoggi?
Well, foreign money has been in America for a very long time. It didn't get invented in 1981.
Right.
But the expansion took place on a much faster pace. On the investment side of foreigners into the New York circle of financiers, that became a very big business in the 80s. And it started in the 70s, and it kept on growing and increasing. And President Trump was a very fast-lane person. He socialized in that fast lane. He knew the people. He went to the charity events. He was friendly with everybody in that circle, did business with them, and selling them real estate for decades. And he was part of the group. A very popular man.
He was really a man about town. And there's a really funny story, at least I think it's funny, that those two men, Adnan Khashoggi and Donald Trump, were both declared the cheapest zillionaires in Manhattan at the time, because they fell for a Spy magazine stunt, which sent them refund checks at lower and lower amounts. And only Adnan Khashoggi and Donald Trump, of all the gazillionaires that were sent these checks, were the ones who refunded them. So even though they were very, very rich, they still couldn't still couldn't resist the refund of 13 cents each in the 1980s. What does that tell you about these gentlemen?
That's a funny story, Zev, of describing President Trump as being cheap. He gives away all his salary to charity, his donations to the government. So he might have changed his ways.
We'll have to try the stunt again and see what happens.
But he was spending a lot of money at that time.
Right.
And he was developing an empire at that time. And he was very close to Adnan Khashoggi and Jeffrey Epstein.
Indeed.
Very, very close.
Indeed, he was, because when 1986 rolled around, he gets first signed that he's going to get that yacht. That really incredible yacht that Adnan Khashoggi had. In 1986, he got the sign. He only finally actually got it in 1988, but in 1986, he got the indication that he was going to get it. And that's one of the first times we've begun to realize that there is such a deep financial relationship between Adnan Khashoggi and Donald Trump. Do you know to what extent they were involved in business together?
they had business arrangements, and they were friends. And Adnan Khashoggi had an extraordinary personality of friendship with people. Everybody liked Adnan Khashoggi. He was just that kind of a person. He was a very, very humble, very nice person. And President Trump liked him. And Adnan Khashoggi liked President Trump. I mean, they were friends.
They were good friends. In fact, the story goes like this. Adnan Khashoggi loans $50 million from the Sultan of Brunei. And he then reneges on that loan, and it's in that loan default that the Sultan reclaims the yacht, and he sells the yacht to Donald Trump. That seems to be like a scheme. It doesn't seem like that's really what happened. It seems like the Sultan of Brunei, maybe, and Adnan Khashoggi were trying to figure out how to get the assets out of the Khashoggi estate as he was about to declare bankruptcy, and that Donald Trump may have participated in that. What do you think?
Well, that's a very, very unusual question about moving that asset out. There's no question that the boat, the yacht, was part of the collection of assets. And there was no doubt that Adnan Khashoggi was in financial stress and he was facing problems. But the question of how to remove the asset from the estate and satisfy a creditor of the estate, that is a very interesting point of law, because you can't do that in America.
Right.
You could do that in the Middle East, but that transaction took place in New York City. The transfer of the yacht took place in New York City. It probably was registered outside of America, but the yacht was docked in New York City, so it would have jurisdiction and venue. And it definitely was in the estate, and it was then out of the estate. So your allegation is serious.
Well, it's just what I'm seeing it. I wouldn't say it's a full-on allegation yet, because I don't have any of the proof, because I haven't seen any of the full evidence that that's really their intent, and I don't know if that's the case that they intended it. But it looks like on paper they were trying to get the yacht out, especially because he lands up selling it back to the Saudi Prince Talil, I think, Donald Trump, after a few years. So, you know, it's in his hands for a little short amount of time, and then it gets back into another prince's property in Saudi Arabia.
Well, what you said was a fact, that the yacht was in the estate of Khashoggi, and then it was removed and paid for by President Trump.
Right.
That occurred.
I'm hedging my bets a little bit here, but I understand what you're saying. It does look like that's what happened. Were you ever on the yacht, by the way?
Yes.
And were you aware at the time that it was wired to the gills with cameras that you may not have seen?
No.
It was.
No.
It was.
Well, I believe you, Zev, that we found so much camera videos and camera taping dealing with Jeffrey Epstein. Anything's possible.
Right. What was it like on board?
It was a beautiful vessel, magnificent. Very, very nice. Very expensive, very rich, very special. Super rich
Yes.
would be the appropriate word description.
Right. And then comes along Tom Barak, who you mentioned last week. And then on, I think it's the Black Monday of 1987, that he does this deal that gets him the Plaza Hotel as part of a group of hotels. And he does it by sort of forcing the hand of the sellers on Black Monday, because they were desperate for an offer, and he was able to get a real deal. So he buys the Plaza Hotel for $250 million. And then he basically hands that prize, the crown jewel of this whole thing, to Donald Trump for $410 million a little bit later. So then you've got another sort of Saudi-inspired, I should say, maybe influenced, but I suspect paid for deal by Thomas Barak to to take this Plaza Hotel and basically hand it over to Donald Trump at a real discounted price.
Well, consider that Tom Barak was running assets or managing money or administrating money for the Middle East for most of his career, including now. And he did buy and sell assets of sizable value, and he was very close, one of the closest business relationships to President Trump. So the answer is there was a deep relationship there, and the values or the appraisal of the Plaza Hotel, I think it was double the price of what Tom Barak's company paid for it.
Oh, yeah.
that he sold it to President Trump for.
Yeah, President Trump got a deal.
President Trump didn't keep it very long.
That's true.
He resold it.
Yeah, it went into receivership at some point, maybe, I think, as well. I don't know, but I have to double check that. But it was an unusual purchase and an unusual resale. And of course, Epstein, Barak, and Trump were known as the sort of three amigos around New York City at the time. You know, they were partying it up on a regular basis. They were out of the town all the time. They were these young, wealthy, successful guys who basically had New York at their feet.
Well, let's correct one point. I don't think the Plaza Hotel went into receivership. I think the company, one of the Indian companies that acquired the stake, went into receivership.
Okay.
So I don't want to put a blemish on the Plaza Hotel, because that's a great institution.
Yeah.
I want to be sensitive to that. Now, the entertainment side of what you say, with Epstein and President Trump and the parties and the socializing, that did take place. That was happening.
LB, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. Okay. So, Steve, did you see what Donald was doing with the Plaza Hotel in the short period of time that he owned it? Relatively short. It was only a couple of years. Were you in there with him
Well,
at all?
No, he owned it, yes. I was aware of that he was the acquirer of the Plaza Hotel.
Yeah, and Ivana ran it. Is that correct?
Well, it was part of his group of hotels, yes. They ran it. The Trump organization ran the Plaza Hotel, to my knowledge.
I think so.
I
You're having a hard time hearing because
don't have much. It was an extraordinary deal at an impossible time that fell into Donald's lap yet again with a lot of help from some Saudis.
And it's built into
And
this.
that's the summary. That's the bottom line.
That is the bottom line.
And I do believe we went in and did some renovations, ripped some stuff up in the penthouse suites and all of that. Some rewiring. There's talk of all of that. There's reporting of all that. So I just find the whole thing odd.
Now, you're very versed into the way Donald Trump built his casino empire using the Ace Greenberg connection. And maybe this is a good time for you to share some of that with us.
Oh, me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think that, again, the best reporting on all that is Wayne Barrett, who is following it very, very closely and tracking the sort of oddities around how Donald was acquiring these hotels or these, casinos or land in Atlantic City in order to build Taj and whatnot. So there's two big things that Ace helped him with, and doing kind of the same thing, but there was one that really stuck out for me. Okay, now I can't hear myself at all, Zev.
No, I'm sorry, you can. We can hear you. It's fine. I'm just trying to ride the audio.
Okay,
I can
great.
tell there's an echo that's troubling some people. So
Gotcha.
I'm trying to write it a little bit. Go ahead.
So, aides arranged for Bear Stearns to give these bonds to Donald so that he could purchase. I believe the big one was around resorts, but there was also sort of the Bally's one. And so in there, and all this sort of purchasing, and all this sort of how do I become a New Jersey, Atlantic City big casino mogul, but I don't really have my own capital, my own liquidity, anything that I inherited from my dad, because we know that was all his dad's money at that time, as the New York Times has now shown. Don't really want to spend it. So Ace kind of swooped in there and said, okay, well, here's these bonds we'll give you. They'll be in Bear Stearns' name, but you get control over them. And then when you want to exercise them, you exercise them, and then they'll be yours. So this was a way to get around some gaming commission issues and some other problems that they had with regulators in how Donald was actually acquiring these casinos and building his Atlantic City stuff. And so he basically had control over bonds that had purchased casinos that were still in Bear Stearns' name, and his name wasn't on anything, but this is how he got around everything, and yet he still owned it. He could control it. And so that's sort of like an idea of the sneaky stuff that Ace was, for some reason, willing to risk and pull off for Donald over and over again. This is risky for Bear Stearns as well. So why these men took these extraordinary risks is part of that sort of overall story that we're trying to unpack and look at. Why was it so damn important that this guy, Donald, who's running around sleeping with everybody, hiding Marla Maples and Aspen and other places for these guys that owned the companies that he was actually purchasing for resorts, and he's like hiding people also away in his Trump Tower, giving them, more accurately, giving them condos. And so here you go at a reduced rate. All of this finagling and skirting the law and extreme measures with a big financial institution, Bear Stearns, in order to have these shitty casinos that ended up going bankrupt anyway.
Right.
So there's no management in there. This is not about building anything really. It's not anything of substance. This is bending over backward creative movements to leverage large sums of money right in the midst of huge savings and loan scandals and junk bond scandals and something like Tower, a Ponzi scheme, building itself up. So it has this sort of frenetic energy of like coke addicts run amok, right? That's what it feels like. But you can't put Ace in that category. This is a brilliant, measured, calculated, knowledgeable man putting Bear Stearns on the line for Donald Trump's shitty casinos.
Steve, what do you think about that?
Well, she presented a very informative picture of a deep relationship between both companies, the Trump companies and Bear Stearns companies. Bear Stearns was servicing the Trump companies as their investment banking financier and providing a huge amount of capital to the Trump organization. And there was a substantial comfort level between the CEO of Bear Stearns, Ace Greenberg, and Donald Trump and Fred Trump. These were very successful realtors, unusually successful at the time. And they were not publicly traded as a public corporation. They were private. And they got to know this man, Ace Greenberg, the CEO of Bear Stearns, and all his top officials. And Jeffrey Epstein was in that circle. And there was a very deep relationship.
I mean, that is a very important point.
And he never left Bear Stearns, frankly.
Epstein.
You know, Jeffrey's offshore network of accounts and LLCs and everything that he was up to with his offshore accounts in the Caribbean were still loaded up with Bear Stearns executives, sitting with his companies in these shell LLCs. And he further was still working with the former CEO, actually the current COO at the time of Bear Stearns, who was in charge of their offshore banking businesses. I don't have the guy's name right available for me, but I can look it up in a sec. And this was the guy that actually gave Ace Greenberg, Alan Greenberg, his nickname Ace. They went to school together. They went and took over Bear Stearns together. They were partners. So that guy's still down there with his junior executives or whatever, embedded in Jeffrey's offshore racketeering or whatever Jeffrey was doing with his offshore.
Mm-hmm.
Can't get around that.
You're correct.
Their names are in there.
Epstein left Bear Stearns in 1981, but he didn't sever his other business arrangements with Bear Stearns. He was no longer a junior partner after 1981 when he joined Douglas Lease's companies overseas. And he made investments. Epstein lost money in the two Bear Stearns hedge funds that did not succeed. Epstein was a major creditor in that.
Interesting.
And took a big loss. Those were the two trials where Epstein was supposedly going to cooperate and didn't cooperate. And Epstein was involved deeply. He had $67 million invested in that.
So, in the context...
Could I ask one more question? Well, we have Steve's on this moment. So Tom Barrack knows Jeffrey Epstein. Tom Barrack knows Paul Manafort.
Tom Barrack knows Jeffrey Epstein really well, I have discovered.
Okay. And he knows Paul Manafort, obviously. They've been old friends. And they were friends at this time in the 80s when Jeffrey was setting all his offshore stuff up. He was working with the Leases. And Paul Manafort's working for Ferdinand Marcos. And there's a bunch of Ferdinand Marcos money, art, all kinds of stuff that ends up disappearing with him in this flight that he took from the Philippines. And people are still trying to find all of that. So do you know whether the Leases knew Paul Manafort, knew Tom Barrack, were somehow involved in that?
Let me connect some dots for you. Towers financial loss in the time frame that you're discussing and later on, over $50 million in cash and assets removed from Towers Financial because of the people you're talking about. And that is one of the substantial removals of money engineered by Jeffrey Epstein, attached to John Hall, who went to prison, who is one of the dear friends of Tom Barrack. Tom Barrack signed the first set of paperwork to take over the Towers Financial Healthcare divisions. And then Jeffrey Epstein and Alan Cohn, another associate of Jeffrey Epstein, and Robert Gold, another associate of Jeffrey Epstein, canceled the Tom Barrack transaction and switched it to the name of John Hall, who is literally bankrupt. And over $50, $60 million left Towers Financial to benefit Jeffrey Epstein and John Hall and that group of people. So there was a tremendous embezzlement taking place.
And is that why
you're trying to?
Is that what you say that you've only discovered now? You've discovered now that they're close friends? You said that with a certain tone.
I did not have the research done since the Jeffrey Epstein arrest in 2019. There has been gigantic research published every week about Jeffrey Epstein and Darren Indike, his general counsel and partner, who appears on every transaction. Now it's all published. That was confidential information in a private company that was not published before Jeffrey Epstein's death. And now it's all coming out. And it's all true that these people were deeply involved. Towers Financial lost over $50 million because of these people. I mean, this is amazing. Jeffrey Epstein lined his pockets full of money right here, right in this transaction.
So interesting.
Please continue.
Yeah. Look, I wanted to do a little bit of a further look into what you're talking about here, because at exactly that time, in 1987, Jeffrey Epstein starts this J.E. Epstein and Company, right? And Khashoggi is one of his key clients. Is it only Khashoggi, or is it Khashoggi and Leese?
Well, keep in mind that relationship started in 81, not 87.
Okay.
Epstein started the Khashoggi Lease relationship in the early 80s, but Epstein reorganized in 87 when he joined Towers Financial. He changed around his corporate names.
Okay, so
his picture.
So it was basically a rebranding more than a complete restart.
That's all it was. Right. Yes.
And then you meet him through Douglas Leese. Sorry, did someone try to jump in there? I think LB might have wanted to.
That was me.
Okay, sorry, Eric. Sorry, go ahead. Or did you not want to jump in?
So when you said that finance really exploded, that foreign money has been in America for a long time. It's not new. To wit, we got this place started French money, but in 1981 it expanded. My work as a futurist, looking at the future of economies, I know what really changed in the United States was, if you look at the share of GDP in America represented by the financial sector, in about 1980, I think it was around 6%, and right now it's somewhere around 35%, and it represents a large percentage of the profits of the S&P 500, stuff like that. I'm looking at these dates and kind of timed blow-ups. You have this influx of this cash into the United States through the financial sector in New York, and then within 5-6 years, Epstein's retooling, Khashoggi's in the center of that, and we have a blow-up. But what I've noticed about all these guys is every time there's some financial failure, certain people come out on top. Thoughts?
Stevie there? Steve, can you hear us?
I can hear you, but Eric fell off the grid.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. So he was asking about how all the same people seem to always survive these financial crises, and they all seem to do quite well, regardless of what happens to them. And he wondered if you had any thoughts about that. I think I'm paraphrasing it correctly.
That's good.
Yeah, you are paraphrasing it correctly. And what he was saying, it's the same names that are continuously successful in reaping the harvest away from the poor people to the rich side of the page.
Yeah.
And that's what we're discovering now. And that's what I'm discovering as to what happened to Towers Financial and what happened with what Jeffrey Epstein did to me and Towers Financial, which I didn't know the whole story until recently.
The whole story
meaning how Jeffrey Epstein did it, how he rigged my criminal case. He actually rigged it. He actually did something That's never been done before. And the Washington Post ran a very big, detailed evidence story showing that it doesn't make sense what happened.
Right.
And as you keep on pulling back the onion on Jeffrey Epstein and see that he was never prosecuted for 30 years with all these financial crimes, the mystery is being told. Why?
Yeah, there's such a lot of emphasis on the sexual crimes, but really one of the reasons he was probably not prosecuted to the full extent of the law in 2008 was because he's an arms dealer for the Queen, amongst others. But, he's an arms dealer.
The sexual crimes got washed away by the enormous amount of money amassed by Jeffrey Epstein.
Mm.
The money side of Jeffrey Epstein is the causation of the sexual crimes.
Mm.
He used that money to intimidate people and blackmail people, and he used that influence over people as a monster to manipulate them and to avoid justice for 30 years.
Unbelievable.
It's ridiculous. He's a monster.
I'd like to run through a few names with you and to ask you which of these people have money invested or had money invested in Towers Financial, and in what capacity. So did Epstein have any of his own money in Towers Financial?
Epstein withdrew tens of millions of dollars from Towers Financial.
He was a
He
taker.
didn't have.
He wasn't giving in that situation.
He's not a giver.
And Adnan Khashoggi had money in there. We know that.
Adnan Khashoggi was a participant with Douglas Leese in the business relationships with Towers Financial.
Right.
Yes.
So we'll take Lease off as well. Robert Maxwell, did he have any money in Towers Financial?
Robert Maxwell, via his daughter, who joined this circle in the 80s overseas, I don't know that they were givers. I think they were takers.
Okay. Thomas Barak, we've spoken about him taking. Did he was he an investor as well, or did he put any money in?
He made a deal, a major deal, with Towers Financial that he signed. Money changed hands, and then the deal got canceled, shockingly canceled, and got transferred over to one of his close friends, John Hall, by the Jeffrey Epstein manipulation with a man named Alan Bone. And that onion's first getting peeled back now. That's where they stole. They stole over $50 million from Towers Financial.
It's unbelievable.
Right then and there.
And right in the light of day, basically seems like they were just able to do that. What about Leslie Wexner? Was he invested in Towers?
He was a giver to Jeffrey Epstein for Jeffrey Epstein's management of the Wexner money.
But not in Towers directly.
But did Jeffrey put it in Towers? Because Jeffrey was pushing money through Towers that he had from clients or whatnot. Correct?
Yes, he was. We do not have the other side of that page. He was using his brokerage firms to move and transfer money and launder money belonging to Towers Financial. The answer is yes. But I can't establish today how Wexner's money was transferred.
Okay, so you don't really know where Jeffrey was getting the money that he was pushing through Towers.
I've seen a lot of documentation of his transferring this money, but I don't know each step he took with the money laundering. I do not know that.
So I think it's important, if we could pause right here for a sec, Zeb, and we'll get to these other names, but maybe the audience needs to a little refresher on what Towers was, what the Ponzi scheme was that Jeffrey was
Good idea.
orchestrating there. So it's money coming in, Steve, and then you pay people out, what, on a monthly basis? A guaranteed
Ponzi
return?
is-
Was it that kind of a Ponzi?
Yes. Ponzi is a simple sentence. You take the new money to pay the old money.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Right.
the Ponzi. That's the definition. So you can apply that definition all the time to financial components of business.
Right. And
You
so
take new
the
money
clients
to
are on
pay
the
old money.
each side of it, right? So they put money in and then they get a percentage return on a regular basis.
Yes.
Okay. And do they have to say where they got the money they were putting in?
Oh, no, kids have to establish that they have the money.
It's just
if
that
they
here's
have
my
the
money. You don't need to know how I made this money. Here it is.
No. Right.
Gotcha. So then when they get it on the other side, it's their same money and they get to register it as a payment from a financial institution. It's clean.
I can say today that I have seen Epstein launder part of that money to his personal gain. Definitely launder part of that money to his personal enrichment. I can say that
So
without
money
question.
from clients back into his pocket, using towers to watch
He
it.
took the money. He took the money.
Okay.
I'm going to give you 3 more names, and then maybe 4 actually. Leon Black, did he have money in Towers Financial?
I don't think that Leon Black had money in Towers Financial.
What about the Saudi?
But
yeah,
Leon Black and Jeffrey Epstein were very, very close in transactional money. So I'm not saying that they weren't doing business with an awful lot of money. And Jeffrey was doing business with an awful lot of Towers Financial money. So I can't answer concisely that pointed question.
Okay. I was going to talk about the Saudi royal family, whether they were invested in there. And then I also wanted to get your opinion on whether Donald Trump had any money in Towers Financial.
The Saudi royal family, I don't think was invested in Towers Financial. I don't believe so. And President Trump, I have not seen any of his organizations as Towers Financial investors. He had very close friends that were associated with him that were participants in Towers Financial. Very close
People
friends.
like Rudy Giuliani.
His closest friend was one of the Towers Financial advisors, William Fugazi.
Interesting. And Rudy Giuliani was your lawyer as well at Towers Financial.
Rudy Giuliani was employed by a law firm. Anderson Kill was the first 2 names of the law firm, and that was Bob Morgenthau, son-in-law Anderson. And Rudy Giuliani was the main lawyer for Towers Financial at that law firm.
Well,
It's a small world.
Okay, but let's land the year. Because when Towers was really building a lot with Jeffrey, Rudy was busy taking out Cosa Nostra, the heads of the 5 families, putting those bosses in jail. Right when all this huge amounts of money starting to arrive and go into our financial markets from overseas, we don't know who. Yeah, Eric was describing that. The same characters keep popping up. I don't know if Steve knows our creative term for them, but the fucketeers and their arms deals and their financial scams and all of their stuff that they're up to. Right at that time, Rudy was in the midst of that Mafia Commission trial with Giovanni Falcone from Italy. Giovanni was the prosecutor a good guy. So he's got to get done with this trial, and then he's a private attorney for Towers.
He leaves the government. He is out of office. He goes to the law firm Anderson, Kill, and another name, which is Bob Morgenthal's son-in-law, and becomes a main partner in that law firm and brings in the Towers Financial client to that law firm, which pays him over $1 million a year. Yes.
Wow. And basically for you, he's doing typical legal work that big corporations need, or is there anything unique that he's doing there for you?
Yeah, he's doing general corporate work required by the many companies under Towers Financial.
Eric, do you have any thoughts on this? This is really your expertise, this whole morass of lawyers and finances and what have you.
Well, it's maybe just general corporate work, but I just find it interesting that Rudy Giuliani just seems to be at the center of all these things, like, just happens to be there for Jeffrey Epstein's Ponzi scheme. He just happens to be there to take down the Cosa Nostra while the Russians are coming in, and then he happens to be the lobbyist. He's the mayor of New York for 9/11, then he's the lobbyist for Purdue, and we're going to get everybody opiates. It gets to be kind of a pattern after a while once you end up here where he's trying to take out foreign service officers in Ukraine.
Yeah, it is.
He's everywhere.
He has good timing or something.
Or something.
Yeah. All right, we'll leave that one there. Let's go to these other, because it's a tough one for anyone to comment on any further. But I want to talk about the leases. So here they are. It's hard to find very much about the leases. You could look them up as much as you want, but the internet is pretty much scrubbed of these guys. The stuff that is there, you have to look pretty hard to find, is a 1984 mention of them getting involved in the AWAC deal. This is when the United States and the British were having a bit of a tiff about who was going to give the Saudis the AWACs. And the British ended up stepping in after Congress, I think, said that America couldn't fulfill that offer. And then in 1986, this giant deal called the Al Yamana deal took place, which was basically an oil for arms deal worth $2 billion, maybe $20 billion by the time it was finished. But it basically was a landmark deal that basically has funded the British arms industry ever since. It seems to me that this was the time that Jeffrey Epstein was in London and working for the leases. So it feels like he may have been involved in one or both of these deals. Steve, do you know if he was?
Jeffrey Epstein was involved in both of those deals. Not one, two. He was the assistant to Douglas Leese and the partner to Julian Leese and Nicholas Leese. And what you're going to find out is that the missing $200 million that just disappeared and then showed up one day in the Virgin Islands and Southern Trust, that came from money laundering of what you're discussing, that $200 million that went into Southern Trust in the Virgin Islands. You're going to find that out, and that's been a cover-up, and that's going to be exposed.
Well, that's a huge story, and I got a little bit of information you might find interesting coming up to share with you about that might even fulfill the circle even further. In 1991, there's another incident involving the leases. This is when they set up, I call it the Toasters for Arms Company. Basically, there's a department store called Littlewoods, and
I have a comment.
And Nicholas's lease sets up an offshore company. Go ahead, Eric. Sorry.
All right, I'm going to vent my spleen. As game theory guy who's been mocked as a conspiracy theorist, that sounds like a parody of people making fun of me, of Toasters for Arms. I just want to point out to the audience, I never came up with Toasters for Arms. It's a real thing. It's not from my fever dream.
It's absolutely a real thing. I came up with a name, and you can forget it after I've described it here because it's really quite silly. But what they basically did, it works like this: they provided the services to Littlewoods by going to the Far East and buying home appliances or toasters and provided them to the Littlewoods clients and customers at a 15% commission. But they also, at the same time, went to China and acquired arms. So here's this nice department store, famous in its history in the UK, providing home appliances to people, not realizing that it's also being used as a cover to acquire weapons from Norinco, the Chinese arms manufacturer, which was then pushed out to the world. Now, I'm not sure if Epstein was involved in this particular deal, but it certainly gives you a good look at how these guys operated.
Epstein was directly involved in that.
Directly involved, even in the 90s?
Yes.
While he was at Towers or afterwards?
During and afterwards. Both.
When did that start?
And before Towers. Norinco started with the Leases way back in the 80s.
Mm. So this is
an old relationship.
Okay, so let's talk about this for a second.
Yeah.
Because this is some of that Iran-Contra stuff that's so fun and horrible. Mm-hmm. There were arms also going to the Sandinistas because the whole point was to have arms on both sides of that war, and there was a both sidesing of the war between Iran and Iraq, which started the whole thing. So putting aside all of that warfare, geopolitical history, we do know around an airline that ended up being, and I'll get the name of this for you, but an airline that ended up having a lot of CIA and intelligence stuff around it that was involved in Iran-Contra, had a plane that got stuck, and I want to remember where it is. I'm so sorry. I'll get these details, but I just want to tell the key point to the story. It kept getting loaded up, and the pilots were taking for the Middle East to Central America. And this one pilot stops one day, and he says, hang on. I need to see what you're putting on my plane. These are the good guys, actually, these pilots. These are our guys, right? Mm-hmm. So, because they kept telling him it's cabbage. It's cabbage. It's lettuce. So he says, let me see the lettuce. So he goes back there. There's a crate stamped with Chinese words, letters, the symbols from some company out of China. They open it up, and it's arms. It's these weapons and weapon launchers.
No cabbages.
Became the joke. It's cabbage and cabbage launcher. So here were arms from China, seemingly, that were getting pushed through the Middle East on an airline that was involved in Iran-Contra for arms that were going to Sandinistas.
Unbelievable. What a story.
And I could never figure out that Chinese language on that box. I have this little detail that's been bothering me for years. So to find out that the Leases, at this point in time, at the point in time of Iran-Contra, are in bed with this Norinco, that makes things click for me a little bit.
The answer is yes, absolutely. That's how it was done. And Epstein was the assistant to the Lease three main executives. Epstein was an intricate part of the three Lease members of the family. And he was directly involved in this with Norinco.
Why?
Directly.
Why are the British buying arms from the Chinese? And whom are they selling it to?
I don't think the British were doing that. I think these arms, and I'm speculating, were moving into the Middle East.
Right, but through a British company, or at least a British-owned company, and a knighted at a knighted, lease. He was a sir, wasn't he? He was part of the order. Like, I mean, he was still has to make sense legally that he was doing these things. He must have got permission from somebody.
Well, that was the mission, bringing the arms into the Middle East. That was the whole mission.
Unbelievable. And how much of this do you think landed up in Towers? Or did any of this land up in Towers? The money, at least?
Well, the principals, Leese, Epstein, the others that were principals, were involved in running all of those arms. Adnan Khashoggi, they were involved in running all those arms. They were involved in all of this.
The other person who was really involved at the time was Ari Ben Menashe, who is the handler of Robert Maxwell. And this is his book that he wrote a while ago called Prophets of War. In that book, he makes two extraordinary claims about what happened to the money that Israel and the United States put into the Iran-Contra deal. Because what they did is they created a slush fund. I think it was like $600 or $800 million each, that it totaled $1.6 billion that they were able to put into the slush fund. And the Israeli money at the end was kept behind the Soviet Union and in other parts of the world in safe bank accounts. The American money was given to the Israelis to look after, because they really didn't want to bring it back home, because it was going to be obvious that they'd done these illegal ops with $800 million. So Maxwell goes up to Prime Minister Shamir in Israel and says, I want to buy a bunch of media companies. Could I get some help from you? And Shamir offers up the American CIA money that was originally put up for the Iran-Contra to Maxwell to guarantee some of these media buys of these big companies that he tried to do in around 1988. Again, it's very similar timing. They come back around in 1991, and they try to do another official deal where Maxwell would get possession of all $800 million and would promise to pay it back to the Americans. And apparently he reneged on that. So reading the Ben Menashe assumptions here, it feels like the money from the CIA operation to run Iran-Contra, to run that whole illegal arms efforts into Iran, $800 million landed up with Robert Maxwell. Would you be surprised by that, or is that something you pretty much thought happened?
That's what I thought did take place.
And so I know LB has a note on how Jeffrey Epstein got his money, and maybe you could fill us in on that, LB, and we'll connect the dot that way.
Well, there was testimony, a deposition in the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, and his deposition taken, Stephen, by one of the attorneys for many of the girls, the victims. And I think it was in 2010, and it was with the deposition was of a woman who was the bookkeeper for Jeffrey's modeling company. So she was his bookkeeper, but really he sort of got her from his partner, Jean-Luc Brunel, because she was with Jean-Luc's company before it became a company with Jeffrey, and they changed their name and all of this. So she'd been with Jean-Luc for years. She'd seen a lot of things. She knew Epstein somewhat. She had met him at the launch party, which I think was like 2006 or something. But she testified under oath, or her deposition, that she had inquired, who is this guy and where did he get all his money? And she was told by someone from within Jeffrey's organization, I believe, that he got it from his girlfriend's dad. And I think it was Edwards was the attorney, Stephen. Right. And he said, she goes, I can't remember the name. And he says, well, was it Ghislaine Maxwell? She goes, yep, that's it. That's where he got his money. And then that poor bookkeeper got smeared to the nines. after that. It's a very tiny little detail in over almost 1,000 pages, what are now released documents from the trial and from the depositions, from the case, because we don't have all of it, but we've had this amount. And you have to be willing to go through all that paperwork, and it's a tiny little excerpt in one woman's deposition. But there it is.
It's outrageous. But that's what you're dealing with. The masterminds of criminality who are still around and are still the shot callers. They're doing it today.
Yeah.
And that's why this case, this mystery case of Jeffrey Epstein, is the crimes of the century.
Mm-hmm. Without a doubt. I mean, you really are looking at a situation here where it looks like the CIA's money, which was already stupidly being spent on getting arms to Iran, land up in Epstein's bank account so he can run a blackmailing scheme where he's raping young women at, on an industrial scale and then blackmailing American politicians using CIA money.
Well, he was funded by the arms sales money, by the lease money, by the Towers Financial money, by the Leslie Wexner money, and all the other money he scammed off the top, and the money laundering.
Mm-hmm.
He moved a lot of money for a lot of people. That hasn't come out yet.
Right, that seems to be the next big chapter of this, is how much money and also who really was involved. I mean, you talk about Sir Douglas Leese, who was a respected member of the inner circle of the royal family. It does, in my research, show that Prince Andrew was not just someone they targeted for a blackmail scheme. He was also very much involved in the arms trades that Jeffrey Epstein and Ari Ben and Adnan Khashoggi were involved in. And on top of that, so is Prince Charles. There are a number of indications that he was involved in signing some of these deals. That's significantly, it ups the stakes significantly in the story of the arms trading.
Well, Epstein used Prince Andrew effectively as his number one trophy, as we all know. Mm-hmm. And it's a pity what Epstein pulled off here, but that's why Leese wanted to move Epstein out of the UK, because he was too hot.
Right.
And wanted to put him in Towers Financial.
Well, that didn't work out so well for the rest of us, right?
America.
Wow. So he was too hot for the UK, and he ended up being even a bigger problem in the United States now, because at the end of the day, this scandal has been around for decades, and it's just beginning to come to a head now, I think. We're just beginning to learn what's been happening for the last 40 years.
And Epstein was the linkage with Leese and the others you mentioned in this show that moved and laundered all of this money. It's amazing.
It must
the
be.
Crimes. The crimes are amazing.
Yeah. Trillions of dollars worth of crimes, you'd think, probably. Like an astonishing amount.
Well, it's the financing of these wars for decades.
Right. This is what has been killing American soldiers in the Middle East, killing other soldiers in the Middle East for decades. Exactly. That's a very good point.
It's outrageous.
War machine.
Hey, Zeb, I just want to give your audience the details on what I brought up before, because you found it. So the airline was Global International Airways. And where this particular event said of, let me see the lettuce, which turned out to be twin-barreled 57-millimeter guns with several dozen cases of ammunition labeling Chinese. And that happened at the Tunisian airport in Algeria. And they were supposed to be flying from Lebanon to Nicaragua with some refugees, to get some refugees in Costa Rica, to get lettuce to the refugees in Costa Rica.
Well, you know who actually might really be involved in that? I just was reading today that Prince Andrew was involved in some weird arms dealing with the Tunisians. So it could be a stretch, could be anybody, but it might actually be.
Over my head.
It may be connected somehow. So I want to go around and just get everyone's final thoughts here because we are a little out of time. We're getting close to there. Eric, do you want to start and just get us your thoughts on what we've learned so far? Are you there? I cannot hear you. No, he's asking if we can hear him. He froze. LB, why don't you go ahead and I'll try to reconnect Eric.
I have a global thought about all of this. And it's a little bit of what we've talked about a lot, Zev, in terms of why is it up to us to do this?
Why are we the only people telling the story so far? Yeah.
Right. And really appreciating Stephen coming forward and saying, yes, I saw these people. Yes, these are the people I know. I do know there was arms deals. And not shirking away either, Stephen, when you take accountability for the criminality that was Towers. And how Jeffrey was perfect because he was a criminal. And so I appreciate that so much. And I find it astounding that although, Zev, you are this seasoned journalist and newsman, and I'm a writer. I've been pulling apart story and putting stuff together my whole career, which is why I like things like Cabbage, Cabbage Launchers. That's a scene, right, in a film.
It's a good scene,
I can write
too.
that. It's a great scene. And, so I can find the story in there and put context to the human behavior around it. And Eric brings his intelligence, knowledge for that side of the world. But why is it us? Where are these big news orgs or the experts in these fields, and why aren't they zeroing in on a firsthand witness to this massive financial crime that this very high profile criminal was involved with? It baffles me and it bothers me. So I'm bothered, and maybe because I'm not having my happy hour, right? But it does bother me.
Yeah.
And and we've taken a couple of hits. People hit, and I'm like, why are you hitting us? We're just following money here. Why aren't you following money? Where are you?
That is the key question.
That's
really
how I feel.
Yeah. It's amazing that these people have not shown up to cover a story that's pretty easy to see at the end of the day.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, Steve? Like, you've been interviewed by so many people, and yet the real story is still not out.
The real story, the untold story, is 75%. It's the financial crimes cover-up that will unravel all of this. And they have started to tell it. They touched on it. It's a very deep story. And the bigger news outlets have started to tell it, but they have not gone as deep as you have gone, Zev. You are the deepest in this story in the media, in the world. And you are telling it.
With
you
your
are
help.
breaking news.
It's only because of what you've been able to share with me.
Shows. But you're breaking news, Zev, on each show, and that's very important. And you can get this financial story told. They'll be interested in telling it. You can get it told. There's no question.
Absolutely. Tonight, I think you broke a couple of really important points that we have to underline before we get away from the show. The first thing is you said that Julian Leese might actually be cooperating, which, now that people have a greater understanding.
Willing to cooperate to avoid his arrest in the UK, because he can be the target easily for this and what Prince Andrew, not on the rapes, but on the other crimes with Jeffrey Epstein that are about to come out. Julian Leese can be the fall guy for Prince Andrew, and that's why I think Julian Leese is a hot potato right now.
Oh, of course, yeah, because they'll offer him up, and he has a lot, I'm sure, to share on what a lot of these people we've been
He's
talking
not
about
like a
today.
fall guy. I mean, he was in there. He was doing all this
Well,
stuff.
but
So
he
he better
will
start
have no
talking.
choice. But he'll start talking.
Mm-hmm. So
Because he's
interesting.
got a problem. He's got a big problem, Julian Leese. He can give up Epstein totally.
I'm sorry.
I also think the Epstein and the news that you said that Epstein was involved in, and I know you've said it in bits and pieces before, but that Epstein was involved in all of those Saudi deals that I pointed out with the leases, the 3 big deals over decades. Boy, that changes the whole scope of what he really was about. You know, for me in any event, you really do get a sense that this guy was arms dealing first, probably money laundering second, and then you only get to the sexual crimes. You know, which is not saying they diminish in value, but that's for him in his mindset. That was probably the most serious thing that he had to deal with was the arms dealing.
Yes. That's what was occurring.
Unbelievable. Well, so much news yet again, and thank you very much, Steve, for joining us on Narrative Live, and thank you to LB and Eric. Always great to have you guys on, and I hope we get to do this again soon. Did you guys want to stay on and actually do another round robin, or are you desperate for your happy hour? This is for LB and Eric. I'm sure you need to go, Steve. What do you think?
We can stay a little bit. Yeah, I think it'd be worth to sort of digest it, because I think it's worth talking about what Jeffrey's arc was.
Right.
And why he needed this persona, why he had to thieve all of this money to set up this persona, set up this mythological life, because he would never have been able to entrap anybody in his industrial scale rape scheme without it.
Absolutely.
The money was the anchor to everything.
Mm-hmm.
It was the anchor to everything. That's right.
Unbelievable story of billions and trillions of dollars, but also decades of war and bloodshed. It's a part of the Jeffrey Epstein saga that is not being told yet, and we'll continue to follow it on Narrative Live. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll be back again with another episode in the near future. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.